In a time where social justice organizations are under attack, we bring you Rad Ops. That stands for Radical Operations, a dialogue-based tool that supports organizations assessing and discussing the possibilities and limitations of putting liberatory values into practice.
While the left faces many crises in these times, underpinning everything is the vulnerability of operations and infrastructure of our organizations. So many groups have chosen to establish nonprofit organizations as the entity for their organizing. And now this administration is targeting the tax status of two primary forms of nonprofit organizations, known as 501c3 and 501c4. Our movement has had critiques of the nonprofit industrial complex for decades. We know this is not the ideal structure for our long-term work. Yet, the majority of left organizations are currently dependent on nonprofit structure and on philanthropy for the operations of their projects. We're in a time which calls on us to be nimble and to pivot many aspects of our operations. We received a question to Dear Rad Ops about this, so I'm going to read the question, and then I'll welcome our guest speaker here to share a response and some tools. So the question: my organization is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we're worried about being attacked by the current administration. What other options do we have for our organizational structure in case we lose our C3 tax status? When I read this question, I knew exactly who we needed to hear from. So I reached out to someone who's done a lot of troubleshooting about this with many organizations. Welcome, Lee. Thanks for making time to talk with me today about this. Will you introduce yourself?
My name is Tim Lee. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Center for Empowered Politics.
So Lee, we brought you in here to discuss this question. And I know you do a lot of work that you support organizations to build what folks are calling multi-entity infrastructure. So can you tell us a little bit about what does that mean and why should organizations consider building multi-entity infrastructure in these times?
First, I'll just start off by saying I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice in any form. Kind of sharing our experiences and how we kind of approach this question. So I think one thing to start off with is that your tax status, whether it's 501c3 and 501c4, if you lose it, it's not the end of the world. So that means that if you're a 501c3, your donations that you get are no longer tax deductible to the folks who are giving you donations. And your net income will potentially be taxable as well. And so it doesn't mean that your organization needs to stop operating. So I think that's one thing just for folks to level set on. And you'll have to operate a little bit differently, but at least you can still operate in most cases if you're just losing your tax exempt status. So I think that's one thing for us to be clear about. And so I think that our approach to movement work has been largely coming out of the 501c3 and then the 501c4 structures. And I think we all see the limitations of that. They define and kind of contain what we can or cannot do. And as movement leaders, we have to think about the organizations as different tools for us to be able to accomplish certain goals within a broader frame of what we're trying to achieve. And so when we think about and talk about multi-entity work, we're basically asking folks to think about all the different types of organizations out there, organizational forms out there, and thinking about what is the appropriate work in a 501c3, a 501c4, potentially for-profit LLCs, taxed organizations, so that we're not just contained by the 501c3 or 501c4 boxes, if you will. And so thinking multi-entity means that you're actually thinking about being able to wield any of those entities towards the larger goals of the vision that you as leaders have in the world. And when we talk about multi-entity infrastructure, it's building infrastructure that would allow you to potentially be able to wield any of those tools and use any of those tools more nimbly and more flexibly to be able to switch between one type of organization to another type of organization without having to necessarily recreate everything from scratch.
I love what you said about like even just starting off with it's not the end of the world if you lose your tax status, and because I think there's something in here that people are, we're scared, which makes sense. But also, I think part of what we're talking about in Rad Ops is that our political visions, our organizing projects, and our relationships can outlast the particular infrastructure that we're using at any particular moment. And I feel like I've been inspired by y'all's work to help us understand like what else is there, beyond the C3, C4 statuses. But I guess my next question for you is sort of thinking about this then, like how does building a multi-entity infrastructure increase the resilience of an organization or even just like a political project that's trying to move something in the world?
One of the ways that we see it as helpful to build the nimbleness, resilience, durability of our movements is if you build an infrastructure that can work with different types of organizations, whether it's like a C3, a C4, a PAC, other LLCs, other for-profit entities, worker co-ops. If you're able to build infrastructure that can actually support all of those without being limited by any particular designations, then you can move between them more readily. And you can also kind of like be able to start new types of organizations up without having to recreate infrastructure.
Can you give us an example of what you're talking about, something that folks can, help them understand?
Sure. So I think one way you could kind of look at this is if your infrastructure, and I'm talking about your HR and admin, let's say your HR and admin are held by a 501c3 organization. That means that basically the folks who are employed by your organization are generally restricted to the work that is happening for a 501c3, right? So like your purpose is restricted to that space. So you, for example, like you could not have those folks work with a PAC, right? Like a political partisan committee. But if your infrastructure was, let's say, in a for-profit entity, then you can have relationships with all different types of organizations and be able to kind of service those organizations in a contractual relationship in a way that gives you more flexibility in terms of the types of work that someone might be able to do. So that's like one small example, but I think that kind of applies to many different structures and different kind of applications in operations, whether it's like, the use of expense systems and credit cards to like here payroll and then other services that you might be sharing in the back end.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think the other thing I've learned from you, Lee, is, there's not like one answer to any of these questions, right? That like, I asked you for a pros and cons chart for each option. You were like, that's very dependent on each organization and their conditions. So just reiterating here that like, there's not one simple answer, but there are many, many options for folks to be able to look into and to explore, and to do kind of on their own or with the support of another back office organization. If folks don't know what these acronyms mean, if you're like ABC, LLC, PAC, C34, whatever. So if you're trying to understand what all these acronyms mean, we've got a list for you to check out below that just gives you a definition of what the different types of entities you can be accessing. And then also we have come up with a list of organizations like Center for Empowered Politics and others that you can reach out to for support if you're exploring building out your own multi-entity infrastructure for your organizing. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks for having me on, Sha.
As usual, listeners can find links to the resources we mentioned in the show notes wherever you're watching or listening to this. This series is produced by Josh Elstro with graphic and logo design by Kimmy David and is published in partnership with Convergence Magazine. Music by Tiger Cat, Sha's amazing 10-year-old, with polish by Josh.